Thank you so much for tuning in and watching this incredible performance online with us at Dellasposa Gallery this evening. We are so grateful to Stephen Baxter and David Bamber, who played Francis Bacon and Giacometti. We'll now be turning over to an interview with Michael Peppiatt, writer, art historian, and curator, who wrote this incredible dialogue. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us this evening. Michael, what inspired you to write this play?
Well, it's happened by chance, completely by chance, as most, I guess, good things do. I was writing an introduction to an exhibition of Bacon and Giacometti that took place in 2018 at the Fondation Bela in Basel, in Switzerland. And I got stuck. And it was raining outside, and I started thinking again about these two extraordinary people and the fact that they, because we brought, and this was the first time it had happened, we brought a major exhibition showing both their work together, the way it compared and contrasted, as it were. Obviously I'd been doing research. He had come over to London to oversee the installation of his big show at the Tate. They had a great friend in common called Isabel Rawsthorne, and Isabel, who was close to both of them, wanted them to get to know each other better. So she organized a couple of dinners in Soho, so that they could meet and have time to speak. Bacon and Giacometti, once they'd had dinner, they drinks, and then they ended up at the Colony Room, and which was very much Bacon's home from home. And Bacon ordered some champagne, and they just talked. They talked probably for as late as the club would stay open, or they could find anywhere where they could go on talking, because the way Bacon described it to me, they actually talked through the night. And I think that was partly, we're in sort of summer '65, that 6 months later, Giacometti died, and he knew he was very ill, and Bacon knew he was very ill, and he probably realized this was the last occasion he would ever be able to talk to him, have a heart-to-heart, as it were. And they had a lot in common. They were very different, very, very different people, very different artists. They both considered themselves realist artists. That's to say, Giacometti didn't think of himself as either surrealist or existentialist, and Bacon certainly didn't think of himself as expressionist. He used to say, after all, I have nothing to express. So they thought they were both trying to convey the reality as they saw it, in the most potent way, the most telling way. So they had a great deal to talk about. While I was stuck trying to write this introduction to the exhibition, I started hearing them talk, and that wasn't sort of complete madness, though, you know, one is sometimes closer than one thinks to that. It had started raining. I was in Paris, and it started raining. It was a depressing afternoon, and I suddenly heard them talk, and I thought, well, I'll just write this down. And I knew quite a lot about what they talked about, because I'd met Bacon in 1963, and this was a couple of years later. We were seeing a lot of each other, and he brought back sort of bits and pieces of the conversation. He said Alberto, you know, was very interested in this, and even some quite precise things, like he said they'd had dinner with Bacon's new boyfriend, George Dyer. And as you'll have heard in the play, Giacometti suddenly says, when I'm in London, I feel homosexual. And obviously this amused Bacon a great deal, and they even discussed sending George to Paris so he could learn a trade, like, you know, he was a petty criminal and things were not going well for him, so that he could perhaps learn to, you know, gilding or some kind of art-related trade, or patinating sculpture. Of course, it didn't come off, but that came up in the conversation. I know that for a fact, and several other things. And then other things I imagined, because I knew how Giacometti talked and what interested him most from all the interviews he gave during his lifetime. He interviewed very well and gave a lot of information, as Bacon did too, of course. And so these two voices came together in the Colony Room late at night, when there was a no holds barred dialogue.
How did you first meet Francis Bacon?
Well, again, a matter of chance. I was doing a student magazine, and I wanted to do an issue. This is, yes, 1963, an issue on modern art in Britain, which was a fairly sort of a much smaller concept then than it is now. I mean, it was quite sort of restricted, one might say, you know, with people like Henry Moore and Francis Bacon and Graham Sutherland. I mean, a small group of people, Frank Auerbach, Lucian Freud, but all of them, you know, much less famous, much less renowned than they are now. And somebody said to me, you know, I was a second year student, something like that, and I didn't know much about anything. Somebody said to me, well, you should meet Francis Bacon. And I said, don't be mad. You know, he died, whatever it is, 400 years ago, 500 years ago. He said, no, there's an artist called Francis Bacon. He's just had a show at the Tate, and he's really, people say he's one of the most interesting artists around nowadays. So perhaps you should try and talk to him. So that's what I did. I went up to London with no sort of, you know, not thinking about anything. I didn't look up, you know, what he did or what his painting was like. I just went into this pub in Soho and got myself introduced, and he was very nice to me, very welcoming, very charming, and whisked me off to lunch at Wheeler's. Wow. Fish restaurant. And, you know, I didn't know what was happening, and I worked out one of the people there was called Lucian Freud, another was called John Deacon, the Soho photographer, and, you know, I was just sort of watching all this take place and trying to make appropriate remarks, you know, but on the whole, as I tended to do with Francis, I was just listening and sometimes asking questions. And what began as an interview, we started an interview. I don't know how much I remembered, because that lunch went through the afternoon through various extraordinary bars. I mean, I can tell you that for me, a sort of, you know, this youth, it was a real eye-opener. I'd never seen places like this. You know, I was 20, 22, something like that. And, you know, it was just sort of one strange, exotic horror after another. And my wondering how I'd ever get back to Cambridge, you know, because the last train had long gone, and we ended up at a party in a pub called the Waterman's Arms on the Isle of Dogs. And then somehow or another, I think I got the what was called the milk train at about 5 in the morning back to Cambridge. I mean, really feeling sort of somewhat giddy and I suppose transformed, because I was fascinated by that, you know, I'd never seen anything like it. So and Francis was very welcoming and just sort of said, you know, give me a call whenever you're coming up. And so I did, and then we sort of got on the trail again. And it seemed to me far more interesting than, studying art history in Cambridge. So I began to have a bit of a double life.
Were you aware that you were sort of living history at that time, being surrounded by all these artists?
No, of course not. No, no, no. That, of course, no, you're quite right. You're quite right. I mean, now it all seems different, but there it was just sort of, wasn't exactly hanging out with old Francis, but it was like, I don't know, it was an odd thing. He was a very magnetic person. That's really what it was. I didn't think about much else. He was, he took me around. He took me to marvelous meals. We drank fantastic champagne and all kinds of, wine that I would never have, even known about. And then, we'd be sort of, I'd be taken out of my sort of grungy digs in Cambridge and find myself sipping champagne at the Ritz. It was a fairly sort of kind of understandable excitement. But I mean, John Deacon did say to me, I hope you're getting all this down. He said, it will be really important one day, but I didn't think much about that. I just thought, well, I'll try and get this interview done for my magazine. But the interview went on and on, not because, I got so drunk, which I did, that I forgot all about it, but really because we had a lot of fun. We, I think he liked having a young man sort of hanging on his last words, and it was just very, very enjoyable. I mean, there was some perhaps somewhat, we sailed close to the wind on several occasions. There were things that, that were more perhaps dangerous than situations that were more dangerous than things I'd encountered before. But he was very protective of me. At the same time. I mean, he wasn't somebody, it's a side that somehow people don't perhaps realize because of the violence of the painting, that he was also a very kind man in many ways. If he liked you, if he didn't, that would be perhaps another matter, but otherwise he was a very, he looked after the people he liked.
How did Francis Bacon come to tell you these conversations he had?
Oh, well, it was just in the course of things. He was very impressed by Giacometti. I mean, with Picasso, who was, I suppose, his idol, Giacometti was the other artist he really respected and admired and followed. He never met Picasso, but having begun a friendship with Giacometti, he talked about it quite a lot. And so I remembered fragments that he told me about when, many, many years later, I started just writing this imagined but fact-based dialogue down. Obviously, if it weren't real, it wouldn't have been worth writing. I mean, what I think might be a bit interesting about it is that it is based on the sort of questions that they were both interested in and would have wanted to discuss. And I hope it sheds, some light on the way they thought, the way they, what sort of people they were.
And you were never able to meet Giacometti?
No.
He passed away soon after the Tate and just before your arrival in Paris.
That's right. Yes, yes. Bacon had given me, he said, who do you know in Paris? And of course I knew nobody at all. And he said, well, why don't you go and see Giacometti?
Mm.
So I said, well, Francis, I can't just turn up, you know, and knock on his door and say, Francis Bacon told me to say hello or something like that. And he said, no, I'll write you a letter. So he tore out a middle page, a couple of pages from a Paris match he had lying on the floor, and just wrote, you know, Mon cher Alberto, you know, this is to introduce a great friend who's coming to live in Paris. And I sort of went over to Paris clutching this thing, and fairly soon after I arrived, I found a room to rent, and by chance, it was in Alesia, not far from Giacometti's studio.
Mm-hmm.
So I began circling round his studio. I could see it was his studio because he had Giacometti written on the window of the door, you know. But I didn't dare go and knock. I felt embarrassed. I felt I shouldn't sort of, you know, go and disturb him. Mm-hmm. So after a few days of sort of wandering around with this letter in my hand, when I was back I'd got a job at a sort of magazine that specialized in art. And I said to my new colleagues, I said, I'm trying to deliver a letter to Alberto Giacometti. And they said, well, he's just died. He was in Switzerland. He'd gone back to Switzerland, to the hospital there. He knew he was very ill. Francis knew he was very ill, but he didn't think that he was at death's door, as it were. So I missed Giacometti by a few days, but he would have been very ill, and probably I couldn't have talked to him anyhow. But it left a feeling of loss, as it were, and that spurred off a lifelong interest in him as a man and as an artist.
You've been in pursuit with Giacometti ever since. You did manage to speak to Annette Giacometti, his wife, and his brother Diego Giacometti as well.
Yes. I sort of kind of got into his world. I mean, it wasn't, again, you know, it wasn't really a conscious thing. It's just somehow it happened. I'd already knew David Sylvester, who'd been a sort of close commentator of Giacometti's. He was working, as he had been for years and years, on his book about Giacometti, but I knew he'd written a certain amount about Giacometti and talked to me about him. And then in Paris, I began meeting, as it were, the people that had been in his world, and they all talked in a very sort of affectionate way about him. You know, they felt they'd lost a close, valuable friend, somebody that they really rather set their compass by. You know, he was very, very influential, without ever trying to be so, but just as an example, as another human being. And so I met Jacques Dupin, who'd written the first book about Giacometti, and James Lord, who later wrote his biography. And then, Annette, his widow, and Diego, I even spent quite a lot of time with. I wrote an article about him, and so we had several lunches in the sort of places where he and Alberto used to go in Alesia, the little bistros there. And Diego was a very charming man, and I could sense some of the things about Alberto by being with Diego. You know, they were sort of right hand and left hand, and there were a lot of similarities. You know, they had obviously the same upbringing in a distant Swiss mountain village, and they were tough, resilient. You know, men who didn't complain about discomforts or anything like that. You know, they're able to live in Spartan conditions, which they did. I mean, Alberto lived in a studio where you wouldn't, unless, because he transformed it. It was a sort of, I'm not saying it's exactly a slum, but it was a kind of so dilapidated and so comfortless, when he moved in there. There was not even a proper floor on the underfoot. There was no electricity, no running water. It was a real hovel in a way. But that suited him, and of course he made it a magical space by the work he created there, and also by his personality, by this sort of this kind of aura that he took on.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible looking at some of the archival photography of his studio.
Yes,
see the progression.
and I think Bacon, to some extent, might have almost modelled the chaos of his studio on the chaos of Giacometti's studio, or at least used it as a kind of, I mean, after all, Bacon had been a decorator, and had created pristine interiors, and for a time had lived in a pristine interior himself, whereas his studio was chaotic like Giacometti's.
The Bacon-Giacometti dialogue is an imagined encounter, albeit deeply rooted in fact. Was the experience writing the dialogue a more liberating experience in writing than writing the biographies on the artists that you've done?
It was quicker. It was a lot quicker. I wish, yes, I wish all my writing were like that. It's mostly very slow, very painstaking. And I wrote the play in an afternoon, and that was that.
Wow.
I made a few, I've made a few tweaks since, but it just came. I mean, it was lovely. It was lovely. It was just given to me, as it were. I heard it and noted it down, and I sort of suspected it would be quite accurate. I looked up, I reread some of Giacometti's interviews to try and remember, as it were. I mean, the sound of his voice, because obviously in a play it's very important. That's all you've got, as it were, is the two voices and the appearance. But I mean, it was important to get the tone right, the way of talking. Otherwise, it wouldn't be accurate. And so I made a few tweaks in that sense. For instance, Giacometti's regularly sort of says, says something and says, no. Those sort of things. But on the whole, it came together. Yes, I'd like to write that like that every day.
Oh, that's amazing. And you heard their voices coming to you in the process of writing. That were...
Yeah, it sounds bad, doesn't it? But you do sometimes when you write. I mean, if you're lucky, I suppose you could call it a state of grace. I mean, it has happened to me. I wrote a novel once, which didn't go very far, but every now and then I'd walk along the street. This is when I was living in Paris, and I'd suddenly hear something and say and think to myself, well, that's exactly what she would have said, with that tone. And of course, it's wonderful when when life helps you like that, when the world helps you.
What can we look forward to in the future? What are you working on now?
Well, I seem to come back to the same things. I'm writing a book about, it's just probably will be called Giacometti in Paris. I want to focus on Giacometti's life in Paris. For me, he sums up so much about Paris pre-war and post-war. And those periods have always fascinated me. What I want to try to be able to do is talk more about his relationships with his life in Paris, what it was like to, to be Giacometti, to become Giacometti in Paris, and the close friendships that he developed with women, with writers. I mean, it's not so much his amorous life, though that's a very interesting side to him, and that will be, of course, part of it. But it's more the number and quality of the friendships he developed with writers from, let's say, the surrealist Breton, Éluard, with people like Georges Bataille. There are very, very many of them. And then leading into Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, and others like Jean Genet and Samuel Beckett.
Amazing.
That, it's a very, what's the best way of saying it? It's a very sort of, it does characterize him a lot, that he was drawn to writers and developed lasting, significant friendships with them, and often illustrated their books.
That's true.
But he enjoyed the company of writers.
And you have an exhibition coming up at the Royal Academy soon.
Yes.
Francis Bacon.
Indeed, I'm very fortunate at the moment. Yes, it's an exhibition called Francis Bacon, Man and Beast, and it's really about how important animals and animal behavior were to Francis Bacon in his study of man, as it were, and how the interaction between the two. And I realized, again, it's one of those things that you suddenly, it seems an obvious fact now, but I'd never thought about it because I'd always seen Francis as a very much a metropolitan man, a man of the city, a boulevardier, a sophisticated, going from the Ritz to the last bar open in Soho. But he was brought up on a stud farm, on a horse breeding farm. So, animals were there at the very beginning, particularly dogs and horses. And his introduction to life was amongst animals. And he remained very sensitive to them. I thought that this would be a new way of looking at Bacon's work, an unexpected way, perhaps. But since he was most interested in instinct, in the way people really were, not appearances, their real emotions, their real drives. And he could study this much more easily, of course, by looking at animals, which he did a great deal when he was in South Africa visiting his mother, and obviously he'd seen horses together, and he'd seen animals fighting and mating and dying. So this was a way really into mankind, but without the disguise.
Well, we very much look forward to seeing your exhibition in the new year.
Well, thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you for giving me the opportunity, and I hope your new year begins in a hugely positive and beneficial way.
And thank you so much, Michael, for your incredible work. We wish to also extend our thanks to Stephen Baxter and David Bamber, who performed this evening, two great, incredible actors that we are very grateful to. And thank you to Gifford Marketing, Nikki Gifford, who has helped us along this journey. It's been a real privilege. And to Alex at LS Press, who has just published the book. The book, Bacon Giacometti, A Dialogue, is now available for sale at Dellasposa Gallery. And thank you so much again for tuning in this evening. It's been a great pleasure to be sharing this with you all. you.